I will speak to you as if we are seated together in a dim hall, not as lecturer and audience, but as two minds moving slowly around the same fire. What I am about to describe is not a moral position, not a strategy, not a personality defect, and not a dramatic gesture. It is a psychic event, and like all psychic events of depth, it rarely announces itself. It arrives after a long silence. You have noticed, perhaps with unease, that certain people who once gave endlessly, who listened without defense, who absorbed the moods of a room as if they were weather patterns inside their own chest, eventually vanish, not gradually, not with explanation. One day they are present, attuned, responsive, almost over-available, and then, without warning, without argument, without even the satisfaction of a final confrontation, they are gone, messages unanswered, doors closed without slamming, no visible anger, no revenge, only absence. And what unsettles those left behind is not merely the loss, but the refusal to return, as if something ancient has sealed itself. To understand this, you must abandon the idea that this act belongs to the realm of social behavior. It does not. It belongs to the unconscious, and more specifically, to the moment when the unconscious assumes authority because the conscious personality has failed in its task of self-protection. The empath, as you call them today, is not a type I would have named in this way. I would speak instead of a psyche with unusually permeable boundaries. Such a psyche does not merely perceive others, it participates in them. It does not observe emotion, it inhabits it. From childhood onward, this individual learns, not through instruction but through necessity, that survival depends on sensitivity. The room must be read before the self is expressed. The emotional climate must be stabilized before one's own needs are even formulated. This is not virtue, it is adaptation. In early life, this adaptation often forms around a dominant complex, a parent who was volatile, absent, fragile, or consuming, an environment where love was conditional upon attunement. The child learns that to be safe is to anticipate, to absorb, to soothe, to disappear at the right moment. Over time, this becomes not a behavior but an identity. I am the one who understands. I am the one who feels deeply. I am the one who holds space. These are not lies, but they are partial truths that harden into a persona. The danger of the persona is not that it is false, but that it is incomplete. It becomes a mask that the ego mistakes for the whole face. And when this happens, the shadow does not disappear, it waits. The empath's shadow is not cruelty. That is a common misunderstanding. It is not even anger. Though anger eventually appears as a signal, the true shadow here is self-erasure, the long habit of being absent from one's own life while being hyper-present in the lives of others. Every unspoken boundary, every swallowed resentment, every moment of exhaustion rationalized as compassion, descends slowly into the unconscious. And the unconscious, unlike the conscious mind, does not forget. For many years, the empath believes they are choosing this. They tell themselves a story about kindness, about strength through endurance, about being the bigger person. These narratives are not imposed from outside. They are co-created with the ego to preserve coherence. But there comes a point, often in midlife but not always, when the psyche can no longer maintain the split. The cost becomes too high. Symptoms appear: fatigue without cause, dreams of locked rooms, of floods, of voices that cannot be heard, a growing aversion to contact. The body begins to recoil before the mind understands why. This is the moment when people say they changed, but change is not the correct word. What is happening is a rebalancing of psychic energy. The libido, which has been flowing outward for decades, suddenly turns inward, and when this reversal occurs abruptly, it can feel to others like abandonment. To the psyche undergoing it, it feels like survival. The cutting off without a word is not calculated. If it were calculated, it would be reversible. What you are witnessing is a collapse of the old relational pattern. The empath does not explain because explanation would require re-entry into the same field of emotional negotiation that nearly destroyed them. To explain would be to reopen the channel, and the unconscious, now in command, forbids it. There is often surprise that no final anger is expressed, no accusation, no dramatic declaration. This too confuses those left behind. They expect rage, they receive silence, but silence is not emptiness here. It is fullness. It is the psychic equivalent of a sealed vessel. The empath has discovered, often with terror and relief at the same time, that absence is the only boundary that cannot be negotiated away. You must understand that for such a psyche, words have always been dangerous. Words invite engagement. Engagement invites empathy. Empathy invites collapse. Therefore, when the final withdrawal occurs, it is done without language, not to punish, but to preserve. I have seen this pattern expressed in dreams reported by such individuals. A recurring image is that of leaving a house without telling anyone, walking into a forest, or descending into water. The house represents the old identity, the known roles, the familial and relational expectations. The forest is not escape, it is initiation. It is the realm of the unknown self. The water is not drowning, it is regression into the unconscious where rebirth becomes possible. In none of these dreams does the dreamer turn back. The act is irreversible because it is archetypal. Those who are cut off often ask, "Why didn't they just talk to me?" This question assumes symmetry. It assumes that both parties had equal access to selfhood, equal capacity for boundaries, equal tolerance for conflict. In reality, the empath has often spoken many times, but softly, indirectly, wrapped in care. Their words were not heard because they did not arrive as demands. When the psyche realizes that its language is ineffective, it abandons language altogether. This is why there is no return. To return would require re-inhabiting the old persona. It would require once again becoming the container, the mirror, the emotional regulator, and the unconscious, having finally broken free, will not allow the ego to betray itself again so easily. The door is not locked out of spite. It is locked because the house has burned down. There is also an archetypal dimension to this withdrawal that must be named. The empath, at this stage, is no longer operating primarily in the realm of the personal. They have crossed into the transpersonal. The figure that emerges is not the wounded child, nor the caregiver, but the hermit, the one who withdraws from the village not because they hate it, but because they have been chosen by an inner necessity. In myth, such figures are often misunderstood, feared, or dismissed as cold, yet they carry knowledge that cannot survive in constant contact. To those left behind, the silence feels cruel. To the empath, it feels neutral. This neutrality is perhaps the most shocking transformation of all. The absence of guilt, the absence of urgency. This does not mean love has vanished. It means love is no longer permitted to consume the self. What remains is a quiet, almost impersonal clarity. If you are listening to this and recognize yourself not as the one who was left, but as the one who left, I will say this carefully. Do not romanticize what has happened. This is not enlightenment. It is not superiority. It is a correction, a late and necessary one. You are not more evolved than those you left behind. You are simply no longer willing to die slowly in order to be understood. And if you are listening as the one who was cut off, I will say something more difficult. Your pain is real, but it does not grant you access. The door will not open through explanation, apology, or self-analysis. The only thing that ever reopens such doors, when they reopen at all, is a fundamental change in relational gravity. And most of the time, that change never occurs. The psyche that has learned the power of disappearance rarely unlearns it, not because it enjoys absence, but because it has finally encountered itself in the silence. And once the self has been met in this way, it cannot be abandoned again without consequence. This is not a story about rejection. It is a story about the moment the soul decides it will no longer negotiate its existence. And when that decision is made, it is made far below the level of words. When this withdrawal occurs, it does not feel to the one who leaves like an action taken against others. It feels like a pressure released, as if a deep inner compression held for decades suddenly gives way. There is often an initial period of numbness that follows, not peace yet, not joy, simply the absence of constant vigilance. For the first time, the empath is no longer scanning the emotional horizon. The nervous system, long trained to listen for danger in tone, silence, gesture, finally lowers its guard. And this lowering of the guard is so unfamiliar that it can feel like emptiness. Here many become frightened and mistake the experience for loss of meaning. They ask themselves whether they have become cold, whether something human has died. But what has died is not love. What has died is compulsion. The compulsion to fix, to rescue, to remain available beyond capacity. The psyche, having reclaimed a portion of its energy, does not yet know what to do with it. This is why the period following the cutoff often feels barren. No new attachments immediately form. No replacement bonds rush in to fill the space. The unconscious insists on fallowness. This fallow period is essential. In agriculture, soil that is never allowed to rest eventually yields nothing but thin growth. So too with the psyche. The empath has lived as overused ground, endlessly cultivated by others' needs. Withdrawal is not selfishness, it is psychic regeneration, and regeneration cannot occur while demands continue to arrive. During this phase, the shadow begins to reorganize itself. Remember, the shadow is not merely what is dark or immoral, it is what has been unlived. For the empath, this includes assertiveness, self-interest, refusal, and even a certain capacity for indifference. These qualities, long judged as dangerous or unloving, now emerge tentatively. At first they feel awkward, even shameful. The empath may catch themselves enjoying silence, enjoying the fact that no one knows where they are or what they are feeling. This enjoyment can provoke guilt because it contradicts the old identity. But guilt here is simply the echo of an outdated moral framework. In dreams, this stage often manifests as encounters with unfamiliar figures, a stern woman, a solitary man, an animal that watches from a distance but does not approach. These figures are not threats, they are carriers of missing psychic functions. The psyche is teaching itself new postures toward the world, less porous, less apologetic, more contained. It is important to understand that the empath does not leave because others are entirely wrong. That explanation is too simple and too flattering. They leave because the relational pattern itself has become incompatible with their individuation. Individuation, as I have said before, is not about becoming better. It is about becoming whole, and wholeness always disrupts existing arrangements. Those who benefited, consciously or unconsciously, from the empath's permeability will experience this disruption as betrayal. They may rewrite history to protect themselves. They may say the empath was unstable, dramatic, ungrateful, or cruel. These narratives serve a defensive function. They preserve the old equilibrium in the psyche of the abandoned, but they do not reach the empath anymore. The empath has stepped outside the field in which such stories operate. This is another reason there is no return. To return would mean re-entering a web of projections, and projection is the currency of unconscious relationships. For years, the empath carried others' projections with little resistance. They were the good one, the understanding one, the patient one, the strong one. Now, having withdrawn, they refuse these images as well. Even positive projections feel invasive. They threaten to reinstall the old role. You may wonder whether this withdrawal is permanent in all cases. Psychologically speaking, nothing is permanent in form, but some transformations are irreversible in direction. Once a psyche has learned that absence can protect it where presence failed, it does not forget this knowledge. It becomes part of its instinctual repertoire. Even if new relationships are formed, they are formed on different terms. The old degree of emotional exposure is never fully restored. At this point, something subtle but decisive occurs. Authority shifts. Previously, authority lay outside the empath, in the moods of others, in the approval of family, in the stability of relationships. Now authority begins to consolidate internally, not as arrogance, but as orientation. The empath starts to sense, often without conscious reasoning, what is tolerable and what is not. This sensing precedes thought. It is felt in the body, a tightening, a dullness, a sudden fatigue in the presence of certain dynamics. These signals are no longer overridden. This bodily intelligence is the voice of the unconscious, refined through suffering. It does not argue, it does not persuade. It simply withdraws energy. When energy withdraws consistently from a situation, the relationship withers, not dramatically, quietly. This is the same mechanism by which the empath once sustained others. Now it sustains the self. There is often a temptation at this stage to justify the cut-off intellectually, to diagnose others, to label them narcissistic, toxic, unconscious. While such descriptions may contain truth, they are secondary. The real event has already occurred beneath language. Over-intellectualization at this stage can actually delay integration, because it keeps the psyche oriented outward rather than inward. The deeper task is not to be right, but to remain faithful to the new internal alignment. Faithful is the correct word here, because what the empath is learning is not technique, but trust. Trust in the fact that one can exist without constant relational confirmation. This trust is fragile at first. There may be moments of loneliness so acute they feel physical. Moments when the old impulse to reach out, to repair, to explain, resurfaces. If these impulses are acted upon prematurely, the psyche often responds with immediate exhaustion or despair. These reactions are not punishment. They are feedback. The unconscious is teaching through consequence. It is saying, this path costs too much. From the outside, this can look like disappearance. From the inside, it feels like alignment with something ancient and impersonal. The empath begins to sense that their life is no longer organized around relationships, but around meaning, and meaning, unlike attachment, does not beg, it does not chase, it draws inward. In mythological terms, this is the moment when the soul leaves the tribe, not to become superior to it, but to encounter the self. The self, as you know, is not the ego, it is the regulating center of the whole psyche. Contact with the self often necessitates withdrawal, because the noise of collective expectation interferes with its signal. Thus, the empath's silence is not emptiness, it is listening to a voice that was drowned out for decades by the needs and emotions of others, a voice that does not speak in sentences, but in direction, and once direction is found, explanations become unnecessary. This is why those who are cut off experience such profound frustration. They want closure, dialogue, narrative, resolution. But the psyche undergoing individuation does not prioritize narrative, it prioritizes coherence, and coherence sometimes requires that stories end without explanation. If you can understand this, you will no longer interpret the empath's disappearance as punishment or abandonment. You will see it for what it is, the moment when the psyche refuses to fragment itself any further for the sake of connection. And that refusal, once enacted, reshapes the entire future of the individual who makes it. The empath does not return, not because they are unforgiving, but because they have finally learned the cost of returning. There is, after this withdrawal, a strange interval that few speak about because it does not fit the language of healing or growth. It is a period of psychic disorientation. The empath, having stepped out of familiar relational gravity, no longer knows who they are in relation to others. And because their identity was built largely through response rather than initiation, this absence of mirrors can feel like a loss of self rather than its recovery. This is the paradox. The empath cuts everyone off to survive, yet in doing so they temporarily lose the coordinates by which they once navigated existence. The old signals are gone, no one is demanding, no one is disappointed, no one is leaning, and so the psyche must now answer a question it has avoided since childhood. What moves me when nothing pulls at me? For a time, nothing does. Days pass without urgency, desires flatten, ambitions lose their charge. This is often mistaken for depression, but it is not the same phenomenon. Depression is a collapse of energy under internal conflict. What occurs here is a suspension of energy while a new center forms. The psyche is recalibrating, and recalibration is silent work. During this phase, memories often surface unbidden, not dramatic traumas necessarily, but small moments long overlooked, a time when the empath wanted to say no and did not, a moment of subtle humiliation swallowed to preserve harmony, an afternoon of exhaustion that was reframed as virtue. These memories return not to accuse others, but to be finally acknowledged. The psyche is integrating its own history, not as narrative, but as sensation. This is also when anger may finally appear, not as explosion, but as density, a heavy, grounded presence in the body. Many empaths fear anger because they associate it with harm, but anger, when it arrives this late, is no longer reactive. It is diagnostic. It reveals where life force was chronically violated, and once seen clearly, it does not demand expression, it demands change. This is another reason explanations feel unnecessary. Anger that has matured into clarity does not need to be voiced outwardly. It has already accomplished its task internally. To speak, it would be redundant. At this stage, something important must be understood. The empath's withdrawal is often experienced by others as a sudden moral failure. They abandoned us, they became selfish, they changed without warning. But from the psyche's perspective, the warning signs were abundant. Chronic fatigue, repeated boundary crossings, emotional asymmetry. These were ignored, not out of malice, but out of unconscious dependence. The empath's presence had become a structural support in other people's lives. When a structure is removed, collapse is blamed on the one who left, not on the imbalance that existed before. The empath senses this instinctively. They feel, often for the first time, the weight of how much they were holding, and this realization is sobering. It brings grief, not pride, grief for the years spent believing that love required self-sacrifice without limit, grief for the younger self who did not know another way to belong. This grief deepens the silence because grief of this kind does not seek witnesses. It seeks containment. The empath learns, slowly, that not all emotions are meant to be shared. Some must be lived through alone so they can complete their cycle without distortion. Here, the archetype of the wounded healer dissolves. That figure, so often romanticized, is revealed as transitional, not final. Healing others was never the empath's destiny, it was their adaptation. Now the psyche begins to imagine a different future, one not organized around repair. This imagination is subtle. It does not announce itself with visions of success or connection. It arrives as curiosity. as an interest in things that have no emotional demand attached to them, a craft, a body practice, a solitary walk, a line of thought followed without interruption. These are not escapes. They are the building blocks of a self that does not exist in constant relation. And it is here that the final irreversibility begins to take shape. Because once the empath experiences themselves as a source of orientation rather than a response, something fundamental shifts. Relationships are no longer the axis of meaning. They become peripheral, optional, conditional. This does not make the empath loveless. It makes them sovereign. Sovereignty is not dominance. It is internal non-negotiability. Certain lines cannot be crossed because crossing them would fracture coherence. And coherence, once felt, becomes more valuable than belonging. Those who attempt to re-enter the empath's life at this stage often sense something has changed. Though they may not articulate it clearly, the empath is calmer but less accessible, kinder but less pliable, present but not absorbent. Conversations do not spiral, emotional bait does not land, the old exchanges fail to activate. This can feel uncanny to those who relied on the empath's responsiveness as a mirror of their own emotional reality. And so the attempts stop or turn into resentment or dissolve into stories told to others. None of this alters the empath's course, because the course is no longer chosen consciously, it is being lived. There is a final point that must be named, because it is often misunderstood even by those who undergo this transformation. The empath does not cut everyone off because everyone is unworthy. They cut off because their psyche can no longer tolerate relationships that require self-abandonment as a condition of closeness. This is a structural change, not a judgment. If a new relationship were to emerge that did not activate the old pattern, that did not demand overfunctioning, emotional labor, or anticipatory care, the empath would not flee. But such relationships are rare because they require mutual containment, not mutual dependence. And until the empath fully embodies this new structure, solitude remains safer than compromise. This is why the silence persists, not as punishment, not as defense, but as alignment. And once alignment becomes the organizing principle of a life, returning to misalignment feels not painful, but impossible. There comes a moment deeper into this process, when the empath realizes that the silence they inhabit is no longer merely protective, it has become formative. At first, silence was chosen because speech had failed. Then it was maintained because engagement was too costly. Now it persists for a different reason entirely. The psyche has begun to speak in a language that noise interrupts. This is a subtle but decisive turning point. Up to now, withdrawal has been largely reactive, even if unconsciously so, a response to exhaustion, violation, depletion, but gradually something else emerges beneath the quiet, a sense of inner density, a center that does not rush outward. The empath begins to feel weight where there was once diffusion. This weight is not heaviness in the depressive sense, it is gravity. Gravity changes everything. When gravity is present, things come toward you naturally, or they do not come at all. Effort decreases, explanation becomes unnecessary. The empath notices that when they speak less, others reveal more, not because they are manipulated into doing so, but because silence no longer fills the space for them. The old reflex to anticipate and soothe has weakened. In its place stands a listening that does not rescue. This listening is often mistaken by others for distance, even judgment, but it is neither. It is the absence of intrusion, and for many people, especially those accustomed to being emotionally carried, this absence feels like rejection. They are not encountering coldness, they are encountering themselves. Here, a profound reorganization of projection occurs. Previously, the empath served as a container for what others could not hold: anxiety, confusion, shame, unprocessed emotion. Now, without conscious intention, the empath withdraws this container. The projections have nowhere to land, they fall back onto their owners. This is experienced as discomfort, sometimes even hostility. You've changed, they say, and in a sense, they are right. But what has changed is not character, it is permeability. At this stage, the empath often becomes acutely aware of how rarely they were truly seen before. How often relationships were sustained not by mutual recognition, but by function. They were the listener, the stabilizer, the emotional translator. Once these functions cease, many bonds dissolve with surprising speed. This can be painful, but it is also clarifying. The psyche begins to distinguish between contact and connection, between familiarity and intimacy. This clarity can feel ruthless at first. It strips away comforting illusions. The empath may realize that much of what they called love was actually endurance, that loyalty was often fear of rupture, that forgiveness was sometimes dissociation masquerading as virtue. These realizations are not accompanied by bitterness. They are accompanied by sobriety. Sobriety is a word worth lingering on. It implies the end of intoxication. The empath was intoxicated by being needed, by being indispensable, by being the emotional axis around which others turned. This intoxication provided meaning, identity, and a sense of worth, but like all intoxications, it demanded increasing doses and exacted a hidden toll. Withdrawal brings clarity, but also the starkness of reality unfiltered. In this clarity, the empath confronts a question that is both terrifying and liberating. If I am no longer needed in this way, who am I? And beneath that, am I still lovable when I am not useful? This question is not answered intellectually. It is answered through experience, through remaining present in one's own life without rushing to fill silence with service, through allowing loneliness without anesthetizing it with connection, through discovering that worth does not collapse in the absence of demand. This is why the empath's withdrawal often coincides with a newfound intolerance for emotional excess, drama, urgency, repeated crises. All of these now feel intrusive rather than engaging. The nervous system, having tasted regulation, refuses to return to chaos. This is not avoidance, it is discernment. At the archetypal level, the empath is moving from the role of the caregiver to that of the witness. The caregiver intervenes, the witness observes. Observation, when rooted in a stable self, is not passive, it is potent. It allows things to unfold without interference. Many cannot tolerate this because they rely on intervention to avoid facing their own inner disorder. The empath, now witnessing rather than rescuing, becomes a mirror rather than a sponge. And mirrors do not absorb, they reflect. This reflection can be deeply unsettling to those who encounter it, because it offers no cushioning, no immediate reassurance, no emotional labor, just presence. This presence is often misread as detachment, but detachment implies disinterest. What is happening here is different. It is non-attachment. The empath can care without clinging, see without merging, feel without dissolving. This capacity was impossible before withdrawal. It required the construction of an inner boundary that did not exist. And once this boundary is established, returning to the old pattern would feel not like kindness, but like violence against the self. This is why appeals to history fail. After all we've been through, after everything I did for you, these phrases once pierced the empath deeply, activating guilt and obligation. Now they land differently. The empath recognizes them as attempts to resurrect an old contract that was never consciously signed. The psyche no longer consents. There is no triumph in this refusal, no satisfaction. Often there is sadness, but sadness without collapse is a sign of integration. The empath is learning to let emotions move through without dictating action. This is maturity, not hardness. Something else begins to occur around this time, something almost imperceptible. The empath's sense of time changes, urgency fades. The future no longer feels like a problem to be solved through relational effort. There is patience where there was once anxiety. Waiting no longer feels like abandonment. It feels like trust in an unfolding that does not require constant management. This shift terrifies those who depend on immediacy, on reassurance, on emotional responsiveness as proof of connection. The empath's calm is interpreted as withdrawal of love, but love has not been withdrawn. What has been withdrawn is compulsive availability. And this withdrawal cannot be negotiated because it is not a boundary set by the ego. It is a condition established by the self. To violate it would invite psychic disintegration. Thus, the empath does not return, not out of punishment, not out of pride, but because they have crossed a threshold. On the other side of that threshold, life is no longer organized around appeasement or repair. It is organized around coherence. And coherence, once tasted, is not something the psyche is willing to lose again. As this process reaches its final depth, something almost imperceptible but irrevocable settles into place. The empath no longer experiences their withdrawal as an event. It becomes a state, not isolation, not exile, but a new internal architecture. The psyche has reorganized itself around a center that does not leak. At this point, there is no longer an inner debate about whether returning is possible. The question simply no longer arises. This absence of inner argument is the clearest sign that the transformation is complete. Where once there was oscillation between guilt and anger, longing and relief, there is now quiet continuity. The empath moves through days without rehearsing explanations, without imagining reunions, without defending the decision internally. What was once charged has gone neutral. Neutrality is often misunderstood. It is taken for indifference or emotional numbness, but neutrality of this kind is highly differentiated. It is the result of having metabolized emotion rather than suppressed it. Nothing is denied, nothing is dramatized. The psyche has learned to hold feeling without being driven by it. Here, the old identity of the empath itself begins to dissolve. Labels lose relevance. The individual no longer needs to see themselves as sensitive, deep, or intuitive in contrast to others. These qualities are now integrated functions, not badges of meaning. Identity shifts from description to presence. This is why the empath silence becomes so complete. There is nothing left to prove, no position to defend, no role to maintain. Speech, when it occurs, is simple and unadorned. It no longer circles around others' reactions. It does not anticipate misunderstanding. It does not soften truth to preserve connection. Words are used sparingly because they are no longer a primary tool of regulation. Those who encounter the empath at this stage may feel strangely unsettled. Even if the empath is outwardly kind, the old emotional hooks do not catch. Attempts to provoke guilt, nostalgia, urgency, or obligation fail, not because the empath resists them consciously, but because there is nothing inside that resonates with the frequency. The psyche has retuned itself. This retuning often reveals something painful in hindsight: how much of the empath's former life was built around managing others' inner states. Once this management ceases, the sheer amount of psychic energy freed becomes undeniable. This energy does not immediately express itself in productivity or achievement. At first, it simply stabilizes the self. The nervous system deepens into rest. The body begins to trust that it will not be required to mobilize on command. Only later does creativity emerge, and when it does, it is markedly different from before. It is not driven by validation or usefulness. It is not offered as service. It arises from inner necessity. Writing, building, thinking, crafting, whatever form it takes, feels private. Even when shared, the work is no longer a bridge to others. It is an expression of inner alignment. Relationships that form at this stage are few, and they are quiet. There is no immediate intimacy, no rapid emotional exchange. Time is allowed to do its work. The empath, now capable of patience without anxiety, does not rush closeness. They observe whether connection arises organically or demands performance. Any hint of the old dynamic emotional extraction, unspoken expectation, asymmetrical labor is felt immediately and avoided without explanation. This avoidance is not defensive, it is instinctual. The psyche recognizes patterns the way the body recognizes heat. It withdraws without analysis, and because this withdrawal is not charged with fear or anger, it does not leave a wake of confusion inside. There is no aftermath to process. The system remains coherent. Looking back, the empath may feel compassion for those they left behind, but this compassion is no longer entangling. It does not reopen doors. It does not invite contact. It simply acknowledges that each psyche follows its own law. Some remain organized around dependence. Others are forced, through suffering, into sovereignty. It is important to understand that this sovereignty is not chosen as an ideal. It is endured as a necessity. The empath did not wake one day and decide to disappear. They were driven to the edge of psychic viability. The withdrawal was the psyche's last intact move, and having discovered that it worked, the psyche does not forget. This is why attempts at reconciliation often fail at this stage. Even when they are sincere, the empath does not reject the person, they reject the structure. Apologies address behavior. This transformation was about architecture, and architecture cannot be undone by remorse. There is also no desire to explain this to others, because explanation would inevitably sound like accusation or superiority, neither of which are felt. The empath knows, with a quiet certainty, that their leaving was not about being right, it was about remaining whole. In the deepest sense, this is the completion of an individuation cycle. A life once organized around adaptation reorganizes itself around authenticity. The cost is high, belonging is reduced, familiarity is lost. But what is gained is internal continuity, the feeling of being the same person in solitude and in relation. From this place, the empath does not fear loneliness. Loneliness is no longer confused with abandonment. It is simply the absence of noise. And in that absence, the psyche rests in itself. So when you ask why empaths cut everyone off without a word and never return, the answer is not found in resentment, trauma alone, or moral failure. It is found in a moment when the soul discovers that its survival requires a different geometry of being. Once that geometry is established, the old maps no longer apply, and the empath does not look back, not because they do not care, but because the path behind them no longer leads to life.